Thank you, Year 7, for working through this warm-up activity so enthusiastically together. We'll be using these thoughts that you've had as the lesson goes on. So keep all this in mind, keep a note of it in your books, and you might need that later on in the lesson. Firstly, just a brief recap of last lesson. So we finished off Rabbit Proof Fence, the film. Can anyone in the class here give us a brief description of what that movie is about? Yes, Adele.
It was about 3 young Aboriginal girls who were stolen from their family and forcibly removed into a camp, and then they ended up escaping and made their way back home over 3 months via the rabbit-proof fence line. 2 of them ended up making it.
That's right. So it's about 3 girls in particular who did get taken from their families and did make their way back following a rabbit-proof fence. But it also speaks of a much broader issue in Australian history, something that's still painful for a lot of people and quite a sensitive subject. So can anyone tell me what that issue is? Yes, Adele.
Is that the stolen generation?
That's right. So the stolen generations, like you mentioned before, was the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families, and that was done under government order, where they were then assimilated into Australian, white Australian society. Like we mentioned last lesson, this is a very sensitive issue in Australian history, and a lot of the language and terms that are used throughout the film would be considered inappropriate or offensive today. So we just have to be really mindful of how we speak about the movie, about the stolen generations more broadly, and just be really respectful of those people whose families have been torn apart by this moment in Australian history. So for the rest of the lesson today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on these learning outcomes that I've got listed on the board here. So by the end of the lesson, I want us to be able to understand what rights children have today in 2020. So that would be what your rights are as young people in today's society. I want us to be able to identify how the rights of the Aboriginal children in Rabbit Proof Fence are represented. So that gives us a snapshot of how Aboriginal children's rights were viewed in 1931 when the movie was set. And then lastly, I want us to be able to compare and contrast these 2 societies. So the society depicted in Rabbit Proof Fence as compared to your society that you live in Sydney in 2020. So as we went through earlier today, during the warm-up activity, we've split what we need to get through our daily routines into wants and needs. So these are things that we expect or that we feel that we're entitled to and that we need to get through each day safely, comfortably, but also with some sort of enjoyment as well. These are all things that perhaps were not taken into account for the children during the stolen generations, and as we saw in the Rabbit Proof Fence, Molly, Gracie and Daisy in that film. So with that in mind, it's important that we get a bit of an understanding of what rights children have, so the rights that you have today. So what I've got on the board here is just a brief overview of what the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990 told us the rights of children should be. Any questions? Yes, Adele?
What's a convention?
So a United Nations Convention is where a lot of different countries come together, representatives from different countries come together, and they come to an agreement on a specific issue. So these issues are usually regarding, human rights, social progression, those sorts of things. So important issues that affect people around the world. So in 1990, all the nations in the world came together and everyone agreed that there should be a universal standard for children's rights. And what I've got on the board here is just an overview of those. So there's a really long document. There's a lot of different things that children are entitled to, but I've just broken it down into 4 main things. And these things all sort of reflect the issues raised during the film and things that you might be able to use in everyday life today as well. So number 1, we've got anti-discrimination. So that suggests that all children have rights regardless of their race, their religion, their language, their gender, etc. Number 2, we have to do what's best for the child. So the child's best interest always must be the most important consideration when we make decisions regarding children. Number 3, all children have a right to life and to survive and develop to their full potential. And then lastly there, we've got on the board, what does a child want? So what the children want, their expectations also have to be taken into account. Again, these are things that you may be floating around your mind. A lot of these are things that we mentioned earlier. A lot of the things were perhaps not given to the children in the movie. So for the rest of the lesson now, what I'm going to do is we're going to answer each of those 4 different points, and we're going to make reference to the film. We're going to make reference to your lives as children in 2020, and then we're going to make some sort of link between the two as well. So the first one we're going to do as a group, then I'm going to split you out into groups of 5 or 6, and then we're going to go through the other 3 points in those groups and come back together and discuss it as a class at the end. So any discrimination. All children have rights regardless of race, colour, gender, language, religion, political or other opinion, nationality, ethnic or social origin, or disability. So is there anyone in the class here that can think of an example from the film where the children were discriminated against according to any of these things? Their race, their colour, their gender? Yes, Adele?
I guess a good example is when the children were ripped away from their family and thrown into the back of the truck because they were Aboriginal. So they were forcibly removed because they were specifically Aboriginal.
Yeah, so that's a really good example, I think. They were taken because they didn't align their lives, the way that Aboriginal people lived, how they looked, wasn't the same as the white people that were making decisions about how they should be looked after, the way that they should be living, all those sorts of things. So Mr. Neville in particular, in the movie, he was given the job officially by the government as the guardian, the legal guardian of all Aboriginal children. And that's a true story. That means that his wants for the children was more important, according to the law, than the
Than their wants?
yeah, than their wants, than what the mother wanted, for example. So that's a great example. Is there any examples that we can think of from today's society where people are getting discriminated against?
Oh, I've got one.
Yes, Adele?
I guess something that has just come up recently is the coronavirus.
Yeah.
I know it started in China and lots of people have been discriminated against, the Chinese in particular, who's always lived in Australia, and they're particularly being discriminated because they have that association by ethnicity of having potentially coronavirus or spreading it around.
That's a really good example, and that's something that's really important to remember in today's society. So you can't judge someone based on what they look like. Because that person looks like something doesn't mean that they have an illness. It doesn't mean that a child can't be looked after just because they live a certain way or they look a certain way. So that's a really great example. And that's what I want us to look at through the other examples as well. So I'm going to split you all off into groups. Yes, Adele?
Can I choose who we're working with? Am I able to choose my group?
Today I'm going to split everyone into groups just because I want a good mix. I want a mix of people that are male, female, just so we have a good understanding of what it's like not to discriminate.
Okay.
Okay, so is there any other questions before I split you all off into groups? No? So great work with that one. I'm going to move around the class and I'm going to observe. I'm going to throw out a couple of thoughts to you if I think that you might need them. And then we're going to come back together in probably about 20 minutes and go over all this as a class. Okay.
Thank you.